Okay. Um, since Merwyn compares a tool to the law, you'll notice suddenly, how did that happen? Now I'm in a garage instead of my office. Okay, so I just the computer ran out of juice right in the middle of what I was doing there. So okay, um, so because Merwyn compares a tool to the law. So this is what happens when we start to think, read the poem several times. And myself, it took me two or three times to kind of see this. But for me anyway, and here's where this writer could have gone into more detail. Where do we see that happening? I see it happening with the phrase order, order. It took me a couple times, and then I thought, order, order. Oh, that's like the guy, the judge pounding the gavel in the courtroom. Order, order, order in the court. Oh, I figured it out. I'm supposed to look where the camera is right there. It's kind of weird because I want to look at myself, but I have to look there. It's not very interesting. Maybe I'll put a little smiley face or something. So yeah, order, order. So the writer gets us to that, but could have given us more support. Explain to us what the writer doesn't do is explain to us how or why she came to the insight or the conclusion or the hypothesis that in fact the poem compares a hammer to the law, and that would be by looking at things like the term order, order, and some other things. Well, she does, though, because she says also because the poem requires slow and attentive reading to understand the meanings of the phrases, comparing, for example, to a novel or simple article. Um, oh, right. Like if you're reading a novel or an article, a news article, you wouldn't have to read it as carefully. So some novels you do almost have to read that carefully. Finally, the informal use of grammar comparing to other readings. For example, it's one truth is stirring in its head. Again, I'm not sure they're exactly what the writer means. That's where, as a writer, or if you're writing a paper, you'd want to unpack that idea and explain it a little bit more carefully. I don't know if the informal use of grammar is in the poem or in other things. The example, it's one truth is stirring in its head. That's actually a perfectly grammatical English sentence. He doesn't capitalize or use periods in the poem, so that might make it hard to see, but it is, in fact, that part of it anyway is a perfectly grammatical English sentence. It's one truth is stirring in its head, but sort of yeah. So my point was to show how a careful look at the poem and the words on the page, and even quoting them and saying them to yourself two or three times and trying to imagine it. And I'm going to send out something on how to read a poem to talk a little bit more about that. But because now that we kind of get this idea of the law, it starts to make more sense, right? So I'm going to read it and just sort of talk it out for myself and for you. Uh, Starting with that second part. The first part still gives me some troubles, but let me just do the second part. It's one truth is stirring in its head. Well, of course, now we have what we call a personification, right? That is the head of the hammer, the part that actually hits the nail, has the claw on the other side, right? Is being literally now compared to the head of a human. And also, we have the idea, right, that the head often has to do with the person in charge. So, so if we go back to the order, order, if we think about the order, order, what we might think of the judge as being the head of the court, right? So now we have head meaning at least three different things: the head of the hammer, the head of a person, and the person in charge are all now functioning in that one word head. And this is one thing that poetry does especially well, good poetry, is that it combines lots of meanings or lots of implications in just a short space, which is something you don't necessarily want to do when you're writing prose, because you want the reader to know exactly what you mean. But in poetry, sometimes it's almost the opposite. It's not that you don't want the reader to know what you mean; it's that you want to have multiple meanings for the reader, meanings that are all deeper because they interact with one another. So when we see that the head of the hammer is like the head of a person, is like the person in charge of a courtroom, who himself uses something very much like a hammer to create order, order, then everything is kind of working together. And then if we go on, we get another personification, and a surprised nail leaps into darkness. Okay, so again, the nail is being personified. Nails don't have surprise. Real nails, right, don't have surprise. But now this nail is being personified as something that has like a consciousness and is suddenly surprised. But then a little weird thing happens. We wouldn't normally think of the nail as leaping. We would say that something like the nail was pounded, right? So oddly, even though in the reality, physical reality, right, the hammer would be applying force to the nail isn't leaping, it's just being reacting, it's being pushed, if you will, by the hammer. But our poet Merwyn decides to make it as if the nail itself is, in a sense, deciding to leap. Or not, if not being deciding to leap, maybe being ordered to leap, which now, as I say that, I see the other meaning of order. I was thinking of order as when the judge says, order in the court, which means, settle down, right? But order also means I order you to do something. I tell you to do something, like a command. And if we think of someone in charge as someone who has the ability to give others orders, and suddenly we see a way in which a hammer is very much like somebody in command of something, whether it's a judge or a politician or a general. So it's like the hammer is giving the nail orders. I order you to jump into the wood, okay? And the nail is like, yes, sir. And the nail leaps into the wood, surprised at the order, if you will, but still leaping himself or itself or herself into the wood. So something along those lines. So the surprised nail leaps into darkness, and of course, as the nail drives into the wood, the nail is going to go into a dark place inside the wood. I suppose if we were to personify that, it might be sort of like if a general told a soldier, go in there, and the soldier has to go into a dark place, not knowing if he's going to live or die or something like that, possibly. Now, see, I don't know if I'm going too far with it, but this is by seeing the relationships, I'm beginning to see things like that. But if we keep going, that a moment before had been nothing, waiting for the law. So and here we get the idea the nail is useless, right? Is meaningless until it does what a nail is supposed to do, which is to hold things together. And this law of the nail, if you will, comes from the hammer, right? The hammer gives the nail its meaning by making it serve its function. and where we could go with this, where Merwyn wants to go with this, I'm not really sure. Does he want to say that we only get meaning as people when we have a function that is provided for us by some larger order, whether it's a military or governmental structure or a family structure or something, that as humans we're nothing until we're put into action, if you will, to fulfill our purpose? I'm not really sure, but that's enough. You guys can start to speculate yourself. But you see how a careful look at the details of the poem, and we've only looked at like 5 little lines, are starting to unpack this whole world of possible meanings in that small little poem. So that's, and that's what happens when you look at the details. There's a reason to look at the details because that's the sort of thing that happens. Okay, finally, let's look at the last poem, which I'm going to call Grasshopper. And, some of you got into this poem. Some of you went, what the heck? That looks like a bunch of nothing to me. And I hope that if you haven't already, you can see that a good deal of the poem is playing on the word grasshopper. And this kind of shows that poems can do all kinds of things. This poem, I'm not sure if it has any like higher meaning or anything like that. And it's not just sort of a form of typographical play. He's playing with the letters that create the word grasshopper. But maybe he's trying to make the letters and the material on the page sort of jump around the way a grasshopper jumps around. Maybe if you look at it, it might be that sort of like the structure of it is this part of it here is where the grasshopper is jumping. We have the grasshopper and then it jumps and we have the grasshopper. I don't know. So if we look there, we can see that he keeps respelling the grasshopper. There's grasshopper, but misspelled or rearranged with the letters rearranged. Again, there's grasshopper, who, and we can't really say this poem, but we can try, who, as we look, up now gath, and then we get grasshopper again. But if we skip grasshopper, we see that this goes down to here, and we have up now. Let me see if I can do it this way. This is kind of hard to do. I need to work on some of my techniques here. Okay. Up now, gather, and then we skip that, gathering into. And then I don't know quite what to do with that part right there, to tell you the truth. I don't know what to do with it. So that one little piece gives me trouble. Gathering into at the, and then here we have the word leap, C-L-E-A-P, and we have a leap typographically, if you will, on the page. Leaps, right? Uh, and then I think we also continue to have the word grasshopper sort of spelled all the way through this. And then what happens here at the very end? Oh, it says arriving. You know, if you start right here, you'll see it says arriving, and then here we still have the word grass, and I think does it finish? Grass. There we have part of grass, but inside of that we have something else. So I still have some work to do there. But also notice he's playing with lowercase and uppercase. Maybe the word grasshopper is in there twice, both upper and lowercase. Maybe that's what I need to look at. So see, I'm not completely sure myself. I don't know. Sorry, did I lose that from you guys? Yeah, I'm sorry. And then what do we have down here? Rearrangingly. Did you see that? Rearrangingly grasshopper. So finally we get the word properly spelled at the end. And the way I got rearrangingly was by not saying the part in parentheses. If we look at the part in parentheses, we have become. So rearrangingly become grasshopper. So what he does here is he kind of, you might say, makes us look at the, maybe, I don't know if this is really so much about grasshoppers as it is about the nature of the written word. That we get so used to the way we read from left to right and the way we use capitals that by kind of messing around with that, he shows us that there could be all kinds of different ways that we could possibly read, you know, intermixing words. How do we use parentheses and so forth? So that poem, I would say, is sort of more like a game, but it's a game that does sort of throw light on typography, I should say, on our literary tool, which actually it's another tool, isn't it? This is also about a tool. It's about the tool of the written word and how we use a certain set of conventions in order to make it meaningful. And if we mess around with those conventions, we have trouble. But if we kind of work at it, it actually throws light on the way the conventions actually work when we kind of mess them up. So that was a start on that. But so those of you who just couldn't, you weren't sure if you could make anything out of the grasshopper, look at it again, and I think you'll see there's a lot of fun stuff going on. As I say, there's still some parts that I'm having a little trouble coming up with an explanation for, but that's part of the fun. So, okay, I think that's more or less what I wanted to do there. And clearly, as you look at those, you can see some ways that, for example, grasshopper is different from our ordinary use of reading and writing, and perhaps also of our ordinary use of spoken language. And some of you already talked about some ways in which tool is as well, and I've also given you some suggestions on the way poetry might be different from ordinary language. Though it might also be similar, because when we talk, we also are ambiguous, right? We might say one thing and mean two or three that even we don't know. If you've ever had like discussions with a spouse or a close friend, and you say something and they think, oh, are you telling me that? And you say, no, that's not what I mean. But on second thought, you go, well, maybe on a certain level that is what I meant. In other words, even in our ordinary language, we often say things that have multiple implications and meanings and suggestions. And that might tie into character contests, that when we talk, we're not only articulating facts, we're also negotiating power and relationships and where we stand in relation to the person we're talking to or what have you. So that might lead into some discussion on character contests that maybe I'll make a little video on that in a minute when I look at your posts. Okay, so I'll stop there. Hopefully as I do this, I'll get better at doing these, and maybe they'll get shorter. But really, we should be willing to have class for 2 or 3 hours a week. So as we go forward, I think at a certain point I'm going to say these sessions are required. You're required to listen to me. Well, it's not in the syllabus. We'll hold off on that. We'll see what happens. I'm learning and you're learning too. Okay? All right. Take care, everybody, and I'll see you later. Bye.